Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello, and welcome to episode 14. Today we take a trek through the caves of the Peak District and encounter a creature from the past in Conan Doyle's 1910 short story, The Terror of Blue John Gap. A little gem of a story, it harks back to some of Conan Doyle's earliest work, while also giving a taste of stories to come. But more of that anon. Here now is Paul with an introduction to the story.
Whilst taking a rest cure in the Derbyshire Peak District, Dr. James Hardcastle learns of the sinister local legendary surrounding the long-abandoned Roman mine-working known as Blue John Gap. Although sceptical about the tales, despite having heard eerie sounds in the vicinity himself, Hardcastle is seized by the spirit of inquiry and adventure and decides to explore. However, deep within the gap his light gives out, and it seems he is not alone.
The Terror of Blue John Gap was written in 1910, in that extremely productive period after Conan Doyle had visited Cornwall, which we described in our episode on The Adventure of the Devil's Foot. And it was several months later that he wrote to his mother and said, "It's only 4 months since I returned from Mullion, and during that short time I have had all the anxiety of the collapse of Temperley," which was his stage play, "with the loss one way and the other of nearly £5,000. I've written the whole of The Speckled Band, another play, and by its aid won the £5,000 back again. I've written The Marriage of the Brigadier, The Terror of Blue John Gap, The Blighting of Sharkey, and a new Sherlock Holmes story, 10,000 words long." So he was incredibly productive in this period, and he appears to have been in a very reflective mood. He revisits Sharkey and Gerard and Holmes at this time, and they'd all been missing from his repertoire for many years. Holmes, perhaps only 2 years, but the previous Gerard was 7 years earlier, and the previous Sharkey was some 13 years earlier. And in many ways, Blue John Gap feels like quite a backward-looking story in that it harks back to that found manuscript approach of some of the Conan Doyle early Gothic stories, and very much has a similar feel to Captain of the Pole Star. Now, the idea for the story appears to have sprung from his newfound interest in paleontology, which I think we'll come on to in a little bit. And he also at this time had a lot of interest in the ancient world, which would be reflected in a spate of historical short stories over the period 1909 to 1911 that would become the Tales of Long Ago. And so you get elements of paleontology and indeed the Romans appearing in the course of this story. And the story was first published in The Strand in August 1910, quite a quick turnaround from delivering the manuscript. And it was accompanied by some rather nice illustrations by Harry Rowntree. We'll put those in the show notes.
It's interesting, talking about the publication history and talking about Conan Doyle's interest in the ancient world at this time, that this story, which is essentially a kind of horror monster story, first appears in book publication in The Last Galley, Impressions and Tales, many of which were these ancient historical stories that Doyle had put together at this time. And then it later reappears in 1922 in Tales of Terror and Mystery, which in many ways seems a more fitting place to put it.
And if you haven't read the story, it's probably a good idea to stop the podcast and read it right now, because we are about to thoroughly spoil the ending. Now, as a horror monster story, this tale has many possible influences and inspirations, and we probably want to go back to Conan Doyle's childhood to start with, and one of his great influences, which is Jules Verne.
Yeah, and one of the real influences on this particular story would seem to be Journey to the Centre of the Earth, which was first published in 1864. in which Verne charts the exploits of Professor Leidenbrock, who finds an ancient manuscript which tells him of where to find an entrance to the center of the earth from a volcano in Iceland. So Professor Leidenbrock and a guide and his nephew descend into the earth through this volcanic opening and have all sorts of adventures and geological discoveries in the center of the earth. And it isn't only geological discoveries that they make during this adventure. At one point they find a vast underground sea, which is immediately named as the Leidenbrock Sea by the egotistical professor. And whilst they're on a rather precarious raft crossing this sea, they encounter a plesiosaurus and an ichthyosaurus, which almost overturn the raft as they have a battle royal in the sea. So we are getting Verne writing this early sort of prehistoric monster story, which will certainly influence Doyle later down the line. And this the Terror of Blue John Gap is almost his first go at this sort of thing.
And Journey to the Centre of the Earth was phenomenally popular in its day. And another work that could be a possible influence is Edward Bulwer-Lytton's The Coming Race.
Yeah, this was first published in 1871, anonymously at first. Bulwer-Lytton at this point was a hugely popular novelist, but most of his really popular works were society novels in the same sort of vein as Disraeli's novels. But he was also very interested in the occult and speculative theories. And The Coming Race is very much in this sort of field. But it again starts similarly to Journey to the Centre of the Earth. This time you have a gentleman hero who goes into a mine with a friend of his, and they both tumble into an underground world. His friend is killed in the fall, and later his corpse is eaten by a dinosaur. But the novel itself goes on to become a speculative novel about the very advanced society that this Victorian explorer finds beneath the earth. Bulwer-Lytton doesn't seem to be particularly interested in the monsters themselves that are also in this world.
No, that's right. He's much more interested in the society and the culture. And classically, for a novel of that era, it's about 20 pages of story, 10 at the beginning and 10 at the end, and the rest in between is an enormous exercise in world building. And it's so hugely influential on people like H.G. Wells. And The Time Machine similarly has an underground civilization. But there are also spiritualist overtones in The Coming Race as well.
The Coming Race has a lot of themes that would interest Conan Doyle throughout his life. There's ideas. It's almost a proto-eugenicist novel, but you've also got this idealistic spiritual world that exists beyond the world that these advanced human beings live in.
And the secret of the power of these advanced human beings is that they can control a substance a bit like ether or electricity, which is called vril. And vril became associated in the popular imagination with vitality, so much so that there were exhibitions dedicated to vril-based products, one of which is a liquid beef extract still popular to this day, which is a combination of bovine and vril, or bovril for short. And you've spotted another possible influence, a very direct influence, in the pages of The Strand itself.
Yes, this is a story which is enormously similar to Terror of Blue John Gap, called The Lizard, which was published in the Strand in June 1898, and written by C.J. Cutcliffe Hine, who was more famous for his naval adventures of Captain Kettle, which appeared in Pearson's magazine. But the Lizard actually is set in the Yorkshire Dales, in Kettlewell, in which a Victorian gentleman explorer goes into a cave and discovers in there the what he thinks are the fossilized remains of a prehistoric lizard. And then these fossilized remains turn out to be not quite so fossilized and chase him out of the cave. It's enormously It is enormously similar to Terror Blue John Gap, even
Yeah.
with its kind of Northern English setting. It's surely beyond doubt that Conan Doyle will have read this story.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's even moments there's the water running through the cave, there's the striking of the matches, there's the narrator thinking about whether or not he's going to be believed. There are enormous similarities in it. I mean, it's almost a lift, to be perfectly honest. I mean, it's interesting that there was an article in the ACD Journal in the 1990s by Batry and Sargent, and they suggested that Conan Doyle might have been influenced by a story called The Killing of the Mammoth by Henry Tuchman, which appeared in the October 1899 issue of McClure's. And that story features explorers who find a remote cave in Alaska. At the end of it, they discover the last surviving mammoth. Although somewhat brilliantly, they end up killing the last surviving mammoth and taking it to the Smithsonian and charging $5 a time, I think, for viewing its skeleton. But there's an awful lot of this stuff around. There's a story from 1888 in Harper's called A Strange Manuscript Found in a Copper Cylinder by James DeMille, which is another lost, recovered manuscript story about a man who journeys to a hidden tropical sea in Antarctica and stays with the Kosakin people and encounters pterodactyls. And you have Frank Mackenzie Savile's Beyond the Great South Wall in 1901, where explorers are searching for signs of the lost Mayan civilization and find a huge reptilian carnivore, which is revered as a god by the Mayans. And then this absolutely bonkers story. French horror and science fiction writer Jules Lemine published L'Effrayante Aventure, which was translated in UK as Panic in Paris, about discovering prehistoric creatures that are frozen in a cavern beneath the streets of Paris, and then they slowly defrost and come to life and cause absolute pandemonium. So there's an awful lot of these stories around.
It's interesting as well you mentioned The Killing of the Mammoth, because once more in Journey to the Centre of the Earth, Professor Leidenbrock's nephew at one point sees a herd of mammoths, living mammoths, under the earth, and they are actually being herded by a 10-foot high early human being. And Leidenbrock's nephew refuses to believe the evidence of his eyes and actually closes off his mind to this as, I haven't seen this, this cannot exist. So again, the author of Killing of the Mammoth, possibly influenced there by Verne. And you also mentioned that the more outlandish examples of this genre, it's quite an outlandish genre to begin with, but the really outlandish examples, and one of the most outlandish, I feel, is The Monster of Lake Le Metrier by Warden Allen Curtis, which was published in Pearson's in August 1899. So again, Conan Doyle may have read this, but it involves the discovery of what the author calls an elasmosaurus, which seems to be some form of plesiosaurus, and this comes to the surface of a lake. It's kind of brought up by a whirlpool. The narrator attacks it with a machete, slices off the top of its head and sees that its brain is the size of a human being's, and he ends up at one point transplanting the brain of one of his friends into the body of the elasmosaurus, and the monster comes back to life and wanders around singing songs in Greek. It's I've read nothing like it.
This is a great subgenre, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah, so there's this general outpouring of monster stories at this time, and they also tie into the fin de siècle concerns, which are finding their way into a lot of popular literature at this time. We've talked in an earlier podcast about the future war scenarios, this unease with military developments. And there's also this general sense of we have reached this point in civilization. Surely something is about to go wrong, and one way of expressing these fears in fiction is through bringing these monsters in that are found usually under the earth, which are going to come back into the earth and destroy us all. But it also ties into the growing professionalism of paleontology as a scientific discipline. And Conan Doyle himself was very interested in this, and particularly when he began to find his own fossils in the quarry over the road.
Indeed, and I think that's one of the things that links the people writing these stories in the 1890s, certainly. They're probably the first generation to have grown up with some of Darwin's theories as being almost the received wisdom of the day. But also there is this massive growth of paleontology as a science, particularly in the last 40 years of the 19th century. The science was a relatively new one. It dated back only to about 1815, when William Smith demonstrated the value of fossils in the study of strata. And then you have Georges Cuvier in France, who was comparing living creatures to fossils to identify the lines of descent. And it's not until 1842 we get the word dinosaur is coined.
Yeah, and even at this point in the mid-19th century, as this science begins to grow, and you mentioned the word dinosaur, which replaces the earlier word of megalosaur or megalosaurus, and this was already starting to enter popular culture, and you can see this in the opening words to Charles Dickens's Bleak House, which was first published in 1852. London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill.
So very much part of the popular consciousness, as you say, and Conan Doyle himself was very much interested in paleontology, and that may have gone as far back as his early days in medical practice. Battery and Sargent, in their article in the 1990s, pointed out that the first bone cave systematically explored in England was actually near Plymouth in 1816, and it's conceivable that he visited locations there, but it was really around 1909, after Conan Doyle had moved to Crowborough in Sussex, that he suddenly found paleontology on his doorstep, quite literally, in the fact that he found fossilized imprints of iguanodon tracks in a nearby ironstone quarry. And he called on Arthur Smith Woodward, who was a paleontologist from the Natural History Museum, who examined the tracks. And he later had casts made of them, which were then displayed in his house. There are a couple of photographs of his hall where you can see the casts suspended from the ceiling. And it was also through, we believe, this connection that he became friendly with Edwin Ray Lancaster, the director of the Natural History Museum, who many people believe was a model for Professor Challenger. In 1905, Lancaster published a book entitled Extinct Animals, which is actually the book that Professor Challenger takes down from the shelf and shows to Malone in The Lost World with the words, "This is an excellent monograph by my gifted friend Ray Lancaster," which is about the highest praise anybody could get from Professor Challenger, who was not known for handing out praise to anybody else. And Conan Doyle was also an investor in Kent Coal, which had unearthed dinosaur remains. So there are lots of things going on at this time that Conan Doyle is personally very interested in and is starting to reflect in his writing. But the monster in The Terror of Blue John Gap is not really a dinosaur. It's an altogether different prehistoric creature.
Yeah, there's nothing lizard-like about it. And when Hardcastle first sees the creature, he just gives a passing description. Says, "I caught a glimpse of a great shaggy mass, something with rough and bristling hair of a withered grey colour, fading away to white in its lower parts, the huge body supported upon short, thick, curving legs." So we just get this impression of this. The first thing that probably comes to mind is some sort of mammoth-like creature. And the way he frequently uses elephantine and elephant comparisons throughout the story.
Yeah, large tracks that even an elephant couldn't make. And then some monstrous inchoate creature. I do like the fact that Conan Doyle does that classic thing that they were always said that you should do with Doctor Who monsters, which is that you only glimpse them very briefly. You don't shine an enormous torch on them to show all of the stitching and the sellotape. But in this case, you do get these very brief glimpses. And when Hardcastle falls in the water and falls asleep, and when he wakes up, he can hear the snuffling of this creature getting closer and closer. There's some genuine menace in this. I mean, the quite amazing thing is that the guy decides to go back and investigate. And there have been other suggestions as to what this monster might be. Batry and Sargent looked at the description and suggested that it might actually be something called the scimitar cat. But Conan Doyle's description is really very, very clear on this point. It's an enormous cave bear. And Harry Roundtree's illustration is fantastic of Hardcastle with his torch shining on this enormous bear that's sort of 8-10 times his size as it looms over him in the centre of this cave.
Yeah, I mean, the only cat-like thing about it is the speed with which it can move, and its ability to move virtually silently.
And there's another feature of the cave bear which is notable. As Hardcastle says, only in one point did he differ from the bear or from any other creature which walks the earth, and even at that supreme moment a shudder of horror passed over me as I observed that the eyes which glistened in the glow of my lantern were huge projecting bulbs, white and sightless. And that's reminiscent of the Morlocks in The Time Machine, who are also underground dwellers and fearful of the light. But white's incredibly symbolic in this and indeed in other works.
Yeah, the other one where you could think of this is Bram Stoker's The Lair of the White Worm, published in 1911, the year after Terror of Blue John Gap, where the worm itself is white, and its human avatar always dresses in white. There's this symbolism of this the draining of colour because these creatures live underground. And it's interesting as well that Conan Doyle makes his creature bear-like and covered in shaggy fur, and I just wonder whether he's doing this possibly to make the comparisons with Cutcliffe Hines' The Lizard less obvious, because Hines' story, it is very much the kind of scaly lizard, whereas here we have a bear-like, a mammoth-like creature, which is very different to the creature encountered in the other story.
And that actually, Stoker's novel comes into Blue John Gap in a couple of ways. One of them is in the location, as we'll probably come on to, but the inspiration for Lair of the White Worm is believed to be the Wearside legend of the Lambton Worm, which was immortalised in folk song, and I remember as a child being sung the story of the Lambton Worm. But it has some similarities to the Conan Doyle story. It could be another possible inspiration. It's the story of in this case, a 14th century worm or lamprey eel. It's an enormous creature that's caught by a knight and thrown down a well where it grows extremely large and poisonous. And actually it starts to get out, and people realise that something is amiss when livestock start to go missing. But it's another example of a prehistoric creature that probably was in Conan Doyle's mind.
And in some ways, Hardcastle can be seen as a sort of modern version of a knight on a quest.
Yeah, he is, absolutely, and that ties into all of Conan Doyle's ideas of chivalry as well. So we've mentioned there Hardcastle, the narrator of the story, and it's worth spending a little bit of time thinking about him and what he represents. At the beginning of the story, he is on a rest cure in Derbyshire, and we've seen that somewhere before, haven't we?
Yes, this very time, 1910, earlier in the year, Conan Doyle himself is on a rest cure in Cornwall, which is where he gets a lot of the inspiration for The Devil's Foot. And in The Devil's Foot, we've got Sherlock Holmes is similarly on a rest cure. And Conan Doyle's obviously playing in his mind with the idea of characters who are outside their normal daily life, wandering into adventures in different parts of the country.
And it's particularly poignant that Hardcastle is wrestling with phthisis, or pulmonary tuberculosis, which is the disease that killed Conan Doyle's first wife, Louise, in July 1906. Hardcastle visits Derbyshire because of its altitude, which was felt to be beneficial. And there are other incidental autobiographical connections to this story. Hardcastle is himself a medical doctor. He studied medicine at Edinburgh. He mentions Coltbridge, which is a district of Edinburgh.
Yeah, it's interesting as well with the Coltbridge reference comes in a quote where Hardcastle is almost saying how he's the man to go investigating this strange cave, because he talks about an incident in his student days. When I was a student, I had the reputation of being a man of courage and enterprise. I remember that when there was a ghost hunt at Coltbridge, it was I who sat up in the haunted house. This could refer back to Conan Doyle's own experiences with the Society for Psychic Research. He investigated a haunted house, or supposedly haunted house, at Charmouth in Dorset in June 1894 with his colleague Frank Podmore.
And he does mention ghost hunts in other stories as well.
Well, in fact, his first surviving story is a piece called The Haunted Grange of Goresthorpe, which he wrote sometime around 1877, and it then sat in the archive at Blackwoods in Edinburgh for decades, and it wasn't actually published until 2000.
And there are another couple of really notable ghost hunts, I think, in Conan Doyle stories. There's one at the beginning of Rodney Stone, although it transpires that isn't actually a ghost. And then in The Land of Mist, there is an even better one where it does transpire that it is a ghost. And Lord John Roxton of the Challenger team goes in search of it with an elephant gun.
As you do.
Good old Roxton. And then there are two very personal incidental asides in the story. One of them is a very casual mention of Chapel le Dale. The church clock of Chapel le Dale chimes in the middle of the Terror Blue John Gap, but Chapel le Dale is actually in Yorkshire, not in Derbyshire. Conan Doyle was confusing it with Chapel on le Frith in Derbyshire. But Chapel le Dale is in Ingleton, near Masongill, where Conan Doyle's mother moved in her later years to live on the estate of Brian Charles Waller.
Which, interestingly enough, isn't far from the location for Cutcliffe Hines the Lizard.
Indeed. And there's another moment which I think is quite sad, actually, in its own way. It's played for laughs in the story, but the moment where Hardcastle goes to Dr. Mark Johnson to explain what's happened, and Johnson listens very sympathetically and says, "Oh, you really need to go and see this chap called Picton of Castleton." Except when he gets to Castleton, Hardcastle discovers that Picton is, quote, the best mad doctor in Derbyshire, and that Castleton is home to his asylum. And of course, Conan Doyle's father had spent his last few years in and out of asylums, and it's very sad to reflect that this might be something that Conan Doyle is drawing on in this moment in this story. And there's another way in which this could be seen as quite a personal story, in that Hardcastle's relationship with science very much reflects where Conan Doyle was in his own thinking at this time. If we go back to this point about paleontology, there's an interesting aside here in that Conan Doyle became really interested in the Piltdown Man in 1912, which was discovered only a few miles from his home in Crowborough in Sussex. The discovery was meant to be that of the missing link, and it caused immense excitement and divided opinion, and ultimately was proven to be a fraud. Conan Doyle actually heard about the Piltdown Man in advance of the public announcement, and he did visit the site frequently. And then in 1983, John Hathaway Winslow, writing in the magazine Science, argued that Conan Doyle was responsible for the Piltdown hoax. And there was a fantastic takedown of the whole argument by Doug Elliott in 1988, who very credibly and robustly debunked the whole idea. For all Winslow's overall theory was nonsense, he did pick on an interesting motive for Conan Doyle faking the Piltdown Man, supposedly, and that was a revenge on scientific materialists and scientific orthodoxy. And you can sort of see in The Terror of Blue John Gap that Conan Doyle is reflecting this in the character of Hardcastle and his relationship with science. It starts on a very bitter note with a letter from Hardcastle to his friend Seaton, essentially berating his friend for not believing in him. And throughout Blue John Gap, Conan Doyle plays with this idea of the burden of proof. He goes out of his way to make James Hardcastle a reliable witness. And in fact, that name, Hardcastle, conveys the idea that he is this solid, dependable type. Right at the beginning, we are told that those who knew him best are unanimous in asserting that he was a man of a sober and scientific turn of mind, absolutely devoid of imagination, and most unlikely to invent any abnormal series of events. So he starts as this great skeptic, and in fact, when young Armitage comes to him and tells him of some of the incidents that have been happening around the Blue John Gap, he dismisses them very casually. And as she notes, my incredulity annoyed Armitage so that he turned and left me with some abruptness. And then he hears this roar from the caves, and he's still unconvinced. And then he sees tracks inside the cave and has this moment of perverse logic where, because he rationalizes that this can't be reality, there is no threat. And so he decides to press on with his investigation. I determined, therefore, that I would not be scared by vague and senseless fears from carrying out my exploration. So you get this story throughout that Hardcastle is not a believer, and this is all about making his ultimate testimony much more credible and palatable to the audience. And Conan Doyle is playing with exactly the same point in other stories around this time. There's The Silver Mirror, published in August 1908, in which the narrator is a hard-working accountant who starts to see things in a mirror in his room, and I won't reveal what that is, but again, the whole idea is that he's the reliable narrator. At one point he says, a skeptic would say, no doubt, that I had dropped asleep over my figures and that my experience was a dream. As a matter of fact, I was never more vividly awake in my life. I was able to argue about it even as I looked at it, and to tell myself that it was a subjective impression, a chimera of the nerves, begotten by worry and insomnia. So this man's so reliable as a narrator that actually, even when he's seeing things, he's able to rationalize in his head that actually this might not be happening. But then probably the ultimate reliable witness is actually Professor Challenger himself. The whole story of the Lost World is framed around the burden of scientific proof, and it's because Challenger can't meet the high standards of the scientific rationalist that actually he is challenged to go on his own Challenger expedition. And he has the last laugh ultimately when he unleashes a pterodactyl into the Albert Hall. But all of this is very reflective of Conan Doyle's position on scientific orthodoxy at the time, and his, I think, growing frustration that things that don't meet the burden of scientific proof are dismissed out of hand. And I think it was that sort of dismissal of things without any care and attention to what might be that really concerned Conan Doyle. And in fact, the whole story ends on quite a bitter note about not being believed. Hardcastle writes, I leave these facts behind me, and if you can explain them, do so. Or if you choose to doubt them, do so. Neither your belief nor your incredulity can alter them, nor affect one whose task is nearly over. And there's an interesting aside here that Conan Doyle also has a point about who believes and who doesn't believe. At one point he talks about the locals as being uneducated yokels, but he later describes them as essentially poor honest folk. And it is actually the poor honest folk of the area who eventually push lots of boulders into the mouth of the Blue John Gap so that the creature that is inside can't escape again. And Conan Doyle reflects this in other writing, particularly The Land of Mist, where the spiritualists are all portrayed as honest working class folk who, because of the very simplicity of their views and their lives, are closer to reality, are closer to what is actually going on, whereas the educated and the skeptical are regarded rather more cynically in that work.
And it's really interesting on that point as well that Hardcastle's mentor, Professor Saunderson, is very much described as being from the working class in this Derbyshire Peak District area. So he's risen from that background to become an eminent professor. So it's showing that there is a crossover point where the wisdom of both can come together.
And it's in the same year that Conan Doyle writes The Terror of Blue John Gap that he gives a speech entitled The Romance of Medicine, in which he explores this tension between science and romance, which does filter through into a number of his works, as I've described. In the same year, Conan Doyle reflected this in A Dinner for the Arctic Explorer Peary, and the idea of science progressively filling in the blank spaces of the map and the romance of discovery is being extinguished makes its way into the Lost World through the dialogue of Malone's editor. And in some ways, Blue John Gap is holding on to that romantic notion that there are still fantastical things yet to be discovered, as indeed paleontology was revealing as a relatively new science.
Yeah, he's in Blue John Gap. He's making the point even more so in a way than the Lost World, because this is happening in Derbyshire rather than South America. It's not happening in some remote locale halfway across the world. This is a local story. And in this whole idea of the romance of science and so on, this is very much showing Conan Doyle having been brought up on Jules Verne's stories. Because Verne was very much into presenting these stories in a way that there is a scientific verisimilitude to them. You look at something like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. A lot of that is almost Verne lecturing about what is to be found under the sea. And the same with Journey to the Centre of the Earth, where there is much discussion of the geology. And it's interesting that the main character in Journey to the Centre of the Earth, Professor Leidenbrock, is another scientific maverick who is mocked by his academic peers, and he goes on to prove that he is right and brings back evidence. And it's interesting that Conan Doyle in Terror of Blue John Gap, which this side of it is certainly modelled on Journey to the Centre of the Earth. Hardcastle talks about the actual geological structure of the Peak District, and says, on each side are the fantastic limestone hills formed of rock so soft that you could break it away with your hands. All this country is hollow. Could you strike it with some gigantic hammer, it would boom like a drum, or possibly cave in altogether and expose some huge subterranean sea. A great sea there must surely be, for on all sides the streams run into the mountain itself, never to reappear. And this clearly shows it's Conan Doyle presenting a convincing scientific reason for what he finds down there, because he's arguing that the sea would create a kind of almost a mini climate in which these prehistoric monsters and flora and fauna of all kinds could thrive. And in Journey to the Centre of the Earth, Leidenbrock and his companions, exactly what they find is an underground sea, which, as I've said before, Leidenbrock then names after himself. And again, in this, you can see with this egotism, he's a definite forerunner of George Challenger in his personality.
And the Blue John Caves are this kind of magical place where you can imagine this immense subterranean world. The presence of Blue John gives us a very explicit location. Blue John is actually calcium fluoride. It's a mineral of a very beautiful purple colour with bands of white. And it's only found in a handful of places in the UK. By far the biggest location is this triangular hill known as Treat Cliff, just outside the town of Castleton, which is smack bang in the middle of the Peak District. The veins of Blue John Cavern are still mined to this day, although there are obviously diminishing deposits of the mineral. And there is a good reason to believe that Conan Doyle visited these caves. Batry and Sargent, in their article, suggested that he might have visited the area in April 1878 when he was a medical student and took up a placement with Dr. Charles Richardson, a doctor in Sheffield. Richardson was an Irishman who'd studied at Edinburgh, and the placement only lasted a few weeks. But they suggest that Conan Doyle might have been able to visit the caves around that time, or also the Sheffield Museum, which had displays on geology and natural history and archaeology. The evidence that we have that Conan Doyle visited the caves comes from a quite unusual source, and that is his 1921 book Wanderings of a Spiritualist, about his tour of Australia. Conan Doyle visited the Jenolan Caves near Brisbane, And in that book, in chapter 11, he writes, the stalactite effects, though very wonderful, are not, I think, superior to those which I have seen in Derbyshire, and the caves have none of that historical glamour which is needed in order to link some large natural object to our own comprehension. I can remember in Derbyshire how my imagination and sympathy were stirred by a Roman lady's brooch, which had been found among the rubble. Either a wild beast or a bandit knew best how it got there. And today you can go and visit the Blue John Caves. I went a couple of years ago to see them, and they are very impressive. There's the tour guides delight in taking visitors to a part called the Devil's Arse, which is a narrow passage supposedly opened up in the 19th century. But when I last posted this fact on Twitter, I got a reply from a former tour guide suggesting that the guides like to make this stuff up because it pleases the visitors. And that quote from Conan Doyle does highlight this connection to the Romans. Conan Doyle says in the Blue John Gap that Blue John was mined by the Romans, but actually there isn't very much evidence for that ever being the case. They certainly mined nearby iron mines, but it doesn't appear that they had mined Blue John. There's a book called Gem of the Peak by William Adam in 1843, which first made this claim, but people have not been able to substantiate it. But Conan Doyle does a very good job of recreating the caves and particularly the surrounding landscape of Derbyshire. If you don't know Derbyshire and the Peak District, but you've seen The Princess Bride, you'll get a very good idea of what it's like because they filmed most of that movie around the Peak District and around the area where Blue John Gap is set. And you previously mentioned Stoker's The Lair of the White Worm, which is also set in Derbyshire. But though Conan Doyle only has a short story in which to deal with the setting and the location, and Stoker has a 40-chapter novel, I think Conan Doyle manages to give a sense of place much more effectively than Stoker manages in his book.
Stoker's novel is all over the place, almost literally. The geography is very, very confusing. You're right. You don't get the sense of place at all in Lair of the White Worm. It is interesting if you want to get an idea of the appearance of the area. Ken Russell's 1988 film version of The Lair of the White Worm does a lot of location work, including the wonderful Thor's Cave. But he wasn't the only one to use the Peak District in film or TV adaptation. The 1986 Granada version of The Priory School also features an awful lot of location work in Derbyshire, and has its climactic scene filmed in Peak Cavern, which it differs from the story, but it's wonderful to watch to just get a sense of this rather eerie cavern.
Yeah, that's the story. The short story is set in and around Mackleton, which Michael Harrison, in his book In the Footsteps of Sherlock Holmes, suggested that Conan Doyle was conflating Matlock and Alfreton, though Castleton could also be an inspiration. And in fact, George Newnes, the publisher of The Strand, was from Matlock in Derbyshire, which is not very far away.
And there's another Sherlockian echo in Terror of Blue John Gap as well. When Hardcastle first hears the creature, before he actually sees it, he says, "Suddenly, from the depth of the tunnel beside me, there issued a most extraordinary sound. How shall I describe it? First of all, it seemed to be a great distance away, far down in the bowels of the earth. Secondly, in spite of the suggestion of distance, it was very loud. Lastly, it was not a boom nor a crash, such as one would associate with falling water or tumbling rock, but it was a high whine, tremulous and vibrating, almost like the whinnying of a horse." This kind of description of an eerie sound is very similar to the descriptions used in The Hound of the Baskervilles, when the hound is heard across the moor but not seen, and when Stapleton tries to insist that it may be the boom of a bittern. And in addition to this sound of the creature, the first physical indication we get of its appearance actually comes from a footprint. Very similar again to Mr. Holmes. They were the footprints of a gigantic hound.
So I think it's fair to say that we both really enjoyed this story. But what really stands out for you, Paul?
I think it's very interesting in that we've got this story published in 1910. not long after Conan Doyle is beginning to find these fossils over the road from his home, and his mind is getting very interested in this whole idea of paleontology, and it ties in, as you said earlier. It almost feels like a throwback story in some ways to his earlier youthful Gothic efforts, but it also is pointing the way to the Lost World, which is going to be published in 2 years' time. And it's almost like he's playing around with ideas in this story, and trying out a prehistoric monster story before embarking upon a novel length work. Perhaps he is subconsciously remembering, Cutcliffe's Hines the lizard, and there's a format I can use. And then he's ready to embark on the Lost World, and it is again interesting that he's used a kind of hairy cave beast in this story, and in the Lost World he will really unleash the lizard creatures that he is really interested in.
I really like the fact that he is experimenting with the idea of legends being real, which comes out in the fact that the Armitage suggests early on about this mystery of the local area, and then you suddenly get Hardcastle, this hardened skeptic who gets dropped into the middle of it, and there are moments in the story where suddenly he thinks about his own role in perhaps discovering what is going on here. There's a great quote, I think. I think of the old world legends of dragons and of other monsters. Were they, perhaps, not such fairy tales as we have thought? Can it be that there is some fact which underlies them? And am I, of all mortals, the one who has chosen to expose it? Which actually is somewhat reflected in some of the early statements Conan Doyle says about his spiritualism as well, and the notion about spiritualist campaigners being right on the forefront of another great discovery. But there's also another thing here going on, which is how the Terror of Blue John Gap ties into early science fiction. I mean, that notion of legends being real is something that becomes a trope in future stories. I mean, most notably in people like Nigel Neal suggesting that there is a scientific basis for the devil in Quatermass and the Pit. So it's another example of Conan Doyle working through lots of different genres and coming up with each time with really exciting, really interesting short stories.
And also the idea of we ignore these old stories at our own peril. It's interesting in Terror of Blue John Gap, the local who tells Hardcastle about this monster later disappears, and we never know we never find out what happens to him. Has he been eaten? We have no idea.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us to the end of the podcast. If you'd like to access the show notes, they can be found at doingsofdoyle.com. But what have we got for our listeners next time, Paul?
Next time, we're going to explore one of Conan Doyle's greatest series characters, the heroic Napoleonic Hussar, Brigadier Gerard, and we're going to give you a double helping of two back-to-back stories: how the Brigadier held the King and how the King held the Brigadier.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to this. So we'll see you next time. In the meantime, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye. Okay, so where did we come off? So
I was talking about monsters singing in Greek.
Yes, you were, as you do.
Where did you go from there?
Okay. Now we have to find a segue from that. Okay.